We'll get started in 30 seconds. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the road to HINAC4 and our presentation today, when sex is a crime and when spit is a crime and sex is a deadly weapon, excuse me. We have some interpretation from English to Spanish. I'll let Jose talk you through that and then we'll get started. Jose?
Buenas tardes todos. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jose Romero. I will be your English to Spanish, Spanish to English interpreter this afternoon. Mi nombre es Jose Romero. Voy a ser su intérprete de inglés a español y de español a inglés esta tarde. The organizers of tonight's call have made a commitment to language justice, and so we will be providing simultaneous interpretation for this wonderful webinar today. Los organizadores del seminario de hoy han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje, así que vamos a estar proveyendo interpretación simultánea durante la sesión de hoy. To access interpretation, if you are joining via a computer, please choose the globe you see at the bottom of your screen and select the audio channel in which you would like to participate today. Si te estás uniendo la llamada de una computadora, por favor selecciona el globo que ves al fondo de tu pantalla y selecciona el canal de audio en cual te gustaría participar hoy. Si te estás uniendo por un teléfono, por favor selecciona los 3 puntitos que ves ahí encirculados en tu pantalla, escoge más y ahí vas a poder seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y seleccionar el canal de idioma. If you're joining through a cellular device today, I'll ask you to click the 3 little dots you see at the bottom of your screen, click the option that says more, and then you should have the option to select an audio channel with interpretation, and then you can participate. Language justice is something we do together. So I'll ask you to remember to take a breath after every sentence and to speak slowly. Thank you for making a commitment to language justice. La justicia del lenguaje es algo que hacemos juntos, así que les voy a dar un recordatorio de respirar después de cada frase, hablar lentamente y gracias por ser un compromiso a justicia del lenguaje. We can go ahead and get started. Podemos iniciar.
Thank you, Jose. When sex is a crime and spit is a deadly weapon. Hi, my name is Malcolm Reed. I'm the program director for Thrive Support Services in Atlanta, speaking to you from Atlanta. I also work with these 2 dynamic gentlemen on the HIV Justice Coalition, working to change the laws in Georgia so that we know, so that they use the science rather than fear to legislate. And so I'm going to first introduce our first panelist, Eric Paulk. Eric is a lawyer and an advocate working on issues impacting the LGBTQ communities and people living with HIV. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of Georgia Equality and oversees the day-to-day operations, developing and managing local, state, and federal policy and advocacy activities that advance equity and fairness for LGBTQ communities and improves public and private responses to the HIV epidemic. He serves on the board of the Atlanta Harm Reduction Coalition and is the former board chair of GLSEN New York City. Eric was recently appointed to the Fulton County Complete Count Commission. He is also an accomplished author publishing social commentary in online outlets, including the Huffington Post, Plus Magazine, the Atlanta Voice, the Atlanta Daily World, Project Q Magazine, and others. And he is a former Victory Institute Victory Empowerment Fellow and a semifinalist for the Echoing Green Fellowship for Black Male Achievement. Most recently, Eric was named one of the top 40 leaders under the 40 by Georgia Trend magazine. And what's not in here is even more recently, Eric was named one of the top 100 LGBTQ representatives in the state of Georgia. We are very happy to have Eric. Eric, go ahead and say a few words.
So good afternoon, everyone. Malcolm, thank you. Thank you, Thrive, for the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to having a robust conversation with all the folks who are joining us today, as well as with my colleagues and my friends, Malcolm and Johnnie, and really unpacking HIV criminalization and really the impact that it has and has had, in particular on Black and other marginalized communities. And so just really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Welcome, Eric. And before we get to our next panelist, I forgot to do something that I was supposed to do. The road to HINAC4, HIV is not a crime, the fourth academy. I'm going to ask Tammy Hart to jump in and tell us about HINAC and what it means and how you can get involved. Tammy?
Thank you so much, Malcolm. The Cero Project produces the HIV is not a crime training academy in partnership with 4 other national networks of people living with HIV. They are the Positive Foods Network USA, Positive Hands, Thrive, and the USPH annual gathering of people living with HIV policy leaders, and other stakeholders to educate and train advocates to mobilize the community to end HIV criminalization, support empowerment of people living with HIV, and facilitate building coalition and common cause with other social justice movements. And we are so thrilled that Eric, Johnnie, and Malcolm are leading, and Thrive SS is leading this webinar today. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tammy. So now I want to introduce our next panelist. If you saw the flyers for this event, the flyers say that Charles Stevens was going to be presenting. Unfortunately, Charles could not make it today, but Johnnie is here to represent CNP, the Counter Narrative Project, formerly known as the Counter Narrative Project. And Johnnie is the creative director of CNP, and he is also the founder and artistic director of Static, STATICC, an arts company with the mission of delivering beauty to the world. Johnnie spent more than 15 years working in corporations and is a subject matter expert in recruiting, call center operations, and professional networking. As an advocate, Johnnie has been involved in HIV and civil rights advocacy as long as he can remember. In the late 1990s, he trained with the American Red Cross in HIV education and did outreach work for the Chester AIDS Coalition. Johnnie is passionate about blending his experiences into his nonprofit work. For the Counter Narrative Project, he has written blogs and has produced and hosted podcast Counterpoint, or has hosted, the podcast Counterpoint. And in 2016, the 2 public bodies of photographic and video work he exhibited, #BeTheFlame and the Untitled, including themes dealing with impact on HIV, Black gay men. And in 2017, Johnnie co-curated World AIDS Day Atlanta events and I Am Arts, Activism and HIV, an exhibit in the National Center of Civil and Human Rights, and about the importance of artistic response to HIV in the community. I will also add that Johnnie is one of my favorite dance partners, and he is a house music aficionado. And I always appreciate just hanging out with Johnnie, just talking about things other than activism and politics. Johnnie, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. I appreciate that. And echoing Eric's statement, I am excited. I'm really excited to continue to around HIV criminals in this country. And I'm happy that everyone is here to partake in this discussion. So please weigh in as we kind of go through this. But yes, Malcolm is one of my favorite dance partners as well. And I actually miss dancing a lot. I'm hoping we could do it in 2021. So.
I'm sure hoping so myself. Lord.
Happy to be here, everybody.
All
you want me
right.
to take it from here?
Well, let's get started.
Wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone. And I am going to kick us off for our presentation and wanted to center us into the discussion that we need to have. So we're going to start with a poem, because why not? Or part of a poem. You are not to touch other flesh without a police permit. You have privacy. The state wants to seize your bed and sleep with you. The state wants to control your sexuality, your birth rate, your passion. The message is clear. Your penis, your vagina, your testicles, your womb, your anus, your orgasm, these belong to the state. You are not to touch yourself or be familiar with ecstasy. The erogenous zones are not demilitarized. This is from The Occupied Territories by Essex Hemphill, an amazing ancestor and activist and creative who gave voice to things that we knew, things that we needed to know at a time when we needed to know them in the late 80s and early 90s. So wanted to bring us into this discussion with words from Essex. And to be very clear about the conversation that we are having today, wanted to talk about what HIV criminalization is, like exactly. We're just gonna lay it out for you. So HIV criminalization is the arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment of people living with HIV for things that are perfectly legal or for minor crimes, for people who have not tested positive, right? So in other words, HIV status is used as a standalone basis to single out people living with HIV for unique and discriminatory treatment by our justice system. This is really important as we get into the conversation today, because we have to understand that the way these laws are written are specifically singling out folks living with HIV. And as we talk through this, we're going to dive into more detail about how that is impacting communities. But this definition grounds us in what this is. So how did we get here? Okay. So we're going to go back in time into the mid to late 80s and the early 1990s, specifically the 1990 the Ryan White CARE Act. So CARE actually stands for Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act. So that is what CARE stands for. And so this particular history, I'm actually going to read from the Center for HIV Law, which gave us kind of a synopsis of how we arrived to have these laws in the first place. And so I'm going to read kind of the first section of this for what we're covering. So from I'm reading, from the onset of the HIV epidemic in the early 1980s, state governments began developing treatment programs and campaigns to decrease transmission of the sexually transmitted virus. However, in their efforts to control the epidemic, state governments also began instituting laws that would punish individuals who transmitted HIV to another person. In 1986, Florida, Tennessee, and Washington were the first states to implement HIV-specific criminal laws. 4 years later, here we are in 1990, the Ryan White CARE Act, which funds for AIDS treatment and care, required every state to certify that its criminal laws adequately could prosecute any individual with HIV who knowingly exposed another person to the virus. So at that time, by 2067, HIV laws had been enacted, and 33 states had one or more of these laws. Now, this has since changed. This is history, right? So wanted to provide context for how we got to where we are. And that started here with the Ryan White CARE Act, and actually began before that, but wanted to kind of provide a bit of history. So, okay, the scope and the features of these laws, right? So here's what we know. I'm not going to read all the things here. I'm going to call out some of the highlights. So what we know under most HIV criminal laws is that transmission is not required, okay? Actual risk of transmission is largely irrelevant. Intent to harm is rarely considered or required. Proof disclosure, often the only defense, is really difficult to prove. And there are severe and disproportionate punishments. So these are some of the key components that go into HIV criminal laws that we need to be aware of, that we wanted to call out today. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric Paulk to walk us through the next section of our presentation.
All right, so in this next section, we really want to unpack how these laws really impact Black communities. And so, I think just putting it really in context of all that we've seen, this year as it relates to our efforts around racial equity, we thought that it was important for us to also unpack HIV criminalization in a way that also talks about race and racial equity, and putting a racial equity lens on that. It's important to talk about the fact that as early as 1986, the CDC had data that showed that Black communities and Latinx communities had an incident rate that was 3 times higher than that of white communities. That by 1993, HIV had become the leading cause of death for Black men 25 to 44, and Black women, the second leading cause of death for women in that same age group. And so just to kind of, put this in context, Black communities and other communities of color have been impacted by HIV since the beginning of the epidemic, even though things like the Minority AIDS Initiative didn't happen until 1988. So 1998, I'm sorry. So funding dollars specifically addressing the impact of HIV on Black and other communities of color came really late into the epidemic. Johnnie talked about the Ryan CARE Act of 1990. And it's also important to think about what was happening in 1990 as it relates to the war on drugs, as it relates to really this movement towards mass incarceration, and what that all sort of means to Black communities. And so when we have conversations about HIV criminalization, we oftentimes talk about behavior as opposed to having a framework that really talks about institutional barriers that make certain communities more vulnerable to HIV acquisition, and also make those same communities equally vulnerable to heightened risk for criminalization. And so how do we really start to have the conversations about HIV criminalization being a part of the larger conversation around mass incarceration and criminal justice reform that we are looking to have within Black and Brown communities in particular. And so we'll go on to the next slide, Johnnie.
So Eric, before we go on there, we do have a question in the chat box.
Yes.
Can one's unknown HIV status during a sexual act be used against them in court after the fact?
So if the person, most laws are, a lot of the laws are around non-disclosure. And so that means that you would have to know your HIV status in order for charges to be brought. And so a person who doesn't know their status can't be charged. And so, you know, one of the things that we talk about as one of the issues with these laws is that it could disincentivize people from getting HIV testing. So if you don't know your status, you can't be charged. And so, yeah, and so it's all about the disclosure and knowing your status. And so I hope I answered that question.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. And so the Williams Institute, we partnered here in Georgia with the Williams Institute to really get some reporting on the impact of HIV criminalization in our state. And one of the reasons for wanting this data was one around our efforts to reform the law here in the state, but also to really have a better understanding about who's impacted by these laws. And so the Williams Institute has also conducted similar studies in Florida, Missouri, and in California. And, you know, there are some through lines in some of the data. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And so I think we're ready for the next slide, Johnnie. And so just some of the data from the Williams Institute report here in Georgia. So other folks who are charged with an HIV-related offense here in the state of Georgia, 62% of those folks are Black people. When charged with concurrent offenses, white men are more likely than Black men to be convicted of the non-HIV related offense and not the HIV related offense. So if a person is charged with, if a Black man and a white man are both charged with solicitation and one of the charges under our HIV statute, you know, the white male will be charged for solicitation and not the HIV related offense. Once charged, Black men were more than twice as likely to be convicted of the HIV-related offense than their white counterparts. And then sex work offenses were more likely to involve women, in particular, Black women. And so we have a number of different intersections that are happening here. But what we're seeing here in Georgia and what the Williams Institute report in Florida and in Missouri and in California also bear out is that the burden of HIV criminalization laws is largely falling on folks in Black communities. And so I think that's important data for us to think about and use as we're considering how to reform these laws, the conversations that we're having about them, and who are people that can be potential partners for us in the work. And so I just wanted to point out some of the racial disparities around health and the criminal legal system. And so across all spectrums of care, from diagnosis to reaching sustained viral suppression, Black Americans experience poor outcomes and are less likely to benefit from sustained viral suppression. Black Americans represent about 12% of the overall population, but account for 44% of all new HIV diagnoses. And while the majority of Black people living with HIV are linked to care within a month, only 54% remain in care and less than half are virally suppressed. And so this was important because I think as we sort of think about and unpack things like U equals U and some state reform efforts that allow for people who have a undetectable viral load to not be criminalized under these laws, there are communities like Black communities where achieving sustained viral suppression is more challenging because of barriers. And so perhaps using U equals U and a person's viral load, may not be the best way to think about legislating HIV criminal justice reform, because we have the potential to kind of create a viral divide where, folks who are virally suppressed have the benefit of not being arrested and charges versus those folks who are not able to. And so this next piece just talks a little bit more about just the criminal justice system, and that racial minorities are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and subject to harsher sentences, and that 1/3 of America's correctional population are Black people. And so you really have this sort of like perfect storm of sort of lack of access to and barriers to access to care and treatment, but it also butts up against Black communities who are more likely to, in general, be criminalized. And so just here in Georgia, Malcolm talked a little bit about the Georgia HIV Justice Coalition, which is really leading the efforts here in Georgia around changing and reforming the law here in the state of Georgia. And so just kind of wanted to give folks sort of the anatomy of what an HIV-specific statute looks like. So under Georgia law, it's a felony if a person knows. So we just had the conversation about disclosure and knowing. So knows that they're a person living with HIV and exposes another to HIV through oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse without knowledge and consent of the other person. Condom use is not a defense. Viral load is not a defense. And it's up to 10, it's a felony up to 10 years. I see someone in the chat, does oral include saliva or is it just sex? And so there is a part of the statute that also criminalizes spit, urine, and feces. And that is in direct connection with folks who are in prisons. And so it was a measure that was intended to protect correctional officers and other peace officers. And so our statute does include spit and saliva. All form, we all know that these are modes where you can't transmit HIV. And so, yet another reason that we want to get rid of these laws is because they don't follow the science. And so some of the change that we're looking for is these laws don't have any intent requirement. So we want something in legislation that talks about there being an intent to harm. We want there to be proportionality. And so, if there's no transmission and a person is getting 10 years in prison, no transmission, no real harm that's done, making sure that the punishment is proportionate with the crime. We also want it to be non-disease specific. And so getting rid of that piece as well. And so I won't read all of these changes here that we're looking for in criminal justice reform, but those are just a few of the major ones, including making sure that folks are also following the science. And so I'm going to turn it over to Johnnie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Eric. And so we wanted to set a baseline as to why these laws do more harm than good. So one, Eric just said, they have no basis in science. Two, they are legally unjust. Three, and this is something that I'm glad we continue to have conversations about in Georgia, but overall, is it's contrary to public health goals and the messaging that we continually talk about around HIV. And in addition, it stigmatizes and oppresses folks. So let's talk about misconception. So when we talk about having no basis in science, right? I was going to play a game where what I do is I would have people go into the chat, and if you take spitting and biting and oral sex, if you wanted to put in the chat how likely it would be to transmit HIV through these different means, you can certainly play along, but I think Eric actually already answered that question as to what the responses are. And so spitting, biting, spitting and urine are in the Georgia law. And as we can see, spitting is listed here as rate of transmission negligible, so 0. So when we talk about no basis in science, we wanted to put this slide here to give individuals an idea of what we mean when we say that and how likely transmission might be through these different methods. So once again, diving in, has no basis in science. 2, legally unjust. So take a look at these laws, right? It's unjust prosecution because there's no intent to transmit. Intent to transmit is not required to prosecute, right? Transmission is not often required. I don't know. Disclosure is hard to prove, right? Once again, the laws ignore science and the punishments are disproportionate, which all lead to this legally unjust conversation. Contrary to public health goals. Okay, so we often talk about public health messaging around quote unquote safe sex or condomless sex, right? So it contradicts these public health messages around condomless sex. It may reduce disclosure, and it also may alienate folks from care. So, and also, I think this is really important. So there are no studies that have shown that these laws prevent the transmission of HIV. So they don't deter any behavior. So, and in fact, as Eric mentioned earlier, it may act as a disincentive to HIV testing because we're talking about disclosure, right? And in order to disclose, you have to know what your HIV status is. So all indicating that this is contrary to public health goals. And then of course, it stigmatizes and oppresses. This can be used, so a person's HIV status can be used as a coercive tool by a partner who may not be living with HIV. It further oppresses folks who are already marginalized. Folks' confidentiality can be compromised. These convictions absolutely ruin lives. And the laws stigmatize all folks who are living with HIV. I'm going to turn it back over to Eric.
All right. And so, I started talking about this a little bit just around sort of the potential unintended consequences of using U equals U or treatment as prevention directly into modernizing HIV laws. And so, as I noted before, there's a potential of sort of creating this, viral divide, a viral underclass of folks who are able to achieve sustained viral suppression and those who are not. And we know that the communities that will be most impacted by those are communities that are already marginalized. And there are people who are living with HIV who just will absolutely not be able to achieve viral suppression. And so sort of using that as a standard for modernizing the law could have potential harm. And so just wanted to point out some of the data around who's able to achieve viral suppression and who's not able to obtain viral suppression. So Black Americans living with HIV are able to reach viral suppression at a rate of almost 41%, compared to Latinx communities at around 50%, and white communities at 56%. And again, we see the communities that have the potential to really be impacted. And so I thought it was really important for us to really look at what the data says about who's able to achieve viral suppression and who's not. And so Black youth 13 to 24 experience the poorest outcomes in terms of reaching sustained viral suppression. Only 29% of Black youth 13 to 24 are able to reach sustained viral suppression. And so, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, but, there's also sort of this, pipeline that sort of exists around HIV acquisition and vulnerability to HIV acquisition, and lack of resources and barriers for young people in this age group to be able to get all the resources that they need to achieve sustained viral suppression. And so despite scientific advances, Black communities and other communities of color have not experienced the significant benefits of the new prevention tools. So again, when we think about, treatment as prevention and sustained viral suppression, we also want to look at things such as, access to PrEP and who's utilizing PrEP, and then also access to things like PEP as well. And so condoms, and so I thought this was kind of, important to also talk about condoms. Again, moving away from this framework where we're talking about behavior and shifting it more to a conversation about a framework that talks about the barriers, the systems that make folks vulnerable, just around condom usage. And, the fact that, condom usage may not necessarily be taking place at the levels that people think that they should be. And so just wanted to kind of throw that out as, another thing where we kind of talk about behavior as opposed to talking about the barriers that make folks vulnerable to acquisition. And so how do we fix this? How do we remedy HIV criminalization? And so we were able to kind of do this in a few different ways. And, I think this is always an opportunity for us to be in conversation about, what all of this looks like. And so I think today we've kind of focused a lot more on legislation. And so changing and reforming HIV criminal laws in states. There's also litigation. There have been several efforts in states across the country around, the constitutionality of HIV criminal laws. And so litigation hasn't necessarily gone as far as we hope. I know that there are attorneys also who are looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act as another way to really think about litigation and saying that these laws are unconstitutional and go against the Americans with Disability Act and discriminate based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is media, and how do we work with media and do media training? When you see the headlines, they usually get it wrong. They use a lot of stigmatizing language. They don't talk about the actual science around HIV. They don't talk about the risk of transmission. They don't talk about, all these other things that are really important. The media oftentimes increases the stigma as opposed to reducing the stigma, which I think there are a number of opportunities through media training to do that. And then the last sort of piece is really the grassroots advocacy. Which I think we will need even if we are able to reform HIV criminal laws. We still need folks who are advocates on the ground who are also changing hearts and minds, because that's going to be really a key to this process, because we still have to engage in stigma reduction activities and campaigns really around making sure folks have accurate information so we can really reduce a lot of the stigma around HIV. And so this is just, in Georgia, we have been diligently working on reforming the law. This past legislative session, House Bill 719, we actually were able to move the bill through the House, and due to COVID-19, priorities shifted, and it ended up not moving out of the Senate. But the bill would require intent. It would require that the activities that are listed in the statute have a significant risk of transmission. It would move the charge from a felony to a misdemeanor level of punishment. It removes blood and organ donation, which is a part of our law, and removes provisions involving correctional officers. So that was that whole piece around spit, urine, and feces would be completely removed from the statute. And so, that's kind of the end of our sort of formal presentation, but we want to, hear your reactions. Does this resonate? And what do you see as being the most important problem with HIV criminal laws? And so we want to engage y'all in conversation, answer any questions that you may have, and just hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat, or I believe you can raise your hand. I'm checking the, yeah, you can raise your hand and I can allow you to talk. Before we do that though, I do have one question. So there was some conversation in the chat earlier about U equals U. And that was before you got to that part of the presentation, Eric. And, my answer was that we are working on a bill that considers the science. And then we talked about the viral suppression divide, right? And so what I want to point out, and correct me if I'm wrong, what we are going for in Georgia does not necessarily say undetectable is untransmittable. What we say is look at the science based on the information that was presented about vaginal intercourse, about spit, about saliva. And so our provision says there is not a reasonable, I can't remember how it's worded, but there's not a reasonable mode of transmission here. So when you talk about a reasonable mode of transmission, does that also include the U equals U science?
And so, yeah, and so in our reform efforts, we want to definitely focus on science. We also want to be able to use things like U equals U, if a partner use condoms, all of these things as potential defenses for the person who's living with HIV. What we don't want to do is say that, if you have a sustained, have achieved viral suppression, that you can no longer be criminalized under the law. But a person who's not able to reach that or hasn't reached that is able to be criminalized. And so that's the viral divide, where we don't want to leave folks out of the conversation.
Right.
And we want to be able to protect all people who are living with HIV against criminalization, as opposed to some folks, are protected and others aren't.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have a question in the chat box. What opposition in the Georgia legislature and community did Georgia encounter? And Danielle, I see your question too, and I'll get that too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that and Johnnie can also piggyback on this. We've been working on reforming our law probably for about 6 or 7 years through coalition. And so the coalition has worked steadily, to sort of reach the place that we got to this past legislative session. And so that's been, trainings and conversations with legislators. That's been working in the grassroots advocacy efforts with communities. We actually conducted a study commission with the legislator that really looked at HIV criminalization. They did a review of the statute and had recommendations. We held hearings about HIV criminalization, again, to unpack the science and all of that stuff, partnering with the Williams Institute to get all this additional data. And so it was really a process to get us to a place where we didn't necessarily have strong opposition against. I will say that this past legislative session, we did have some opposition around the charging piece. And so there was someone who felt like it should still be a felony, though a lesser felony, not 10 years, 5 years. And so that was really the only real opposition that we had this past legislative session. And hopefully, as we reintroduce the bill in 2021, maybe we have addressed some of the issues around that. And maybe that person may not be on the committee, but some of it is also about, elections matter, right? So who gets elected and who doesn't get elected really matters in this as well. And so I would say that it's really been a combination of, the work of the coalition and of, the partners, and also having really good relationships down at the legislature, and folks who can sponsor the bill and move it, and who have some power to do that. So.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much. Danielle Warren Diaz has a statement and a question. Well, a question first. Are there comparisons between the reduction in new cases in areas without these laws? She says she's in Connecticut, where these types of laws don't exist, and our community viral load suppression is phenomenal, and new cases decrease every year.
Okay, say that one more time, Malcolm.
Right. Are there comparisons between the reduction in new cases in areas without these laws? She says she lives in Connecticut, and I'm sorry, Dan, I don't know what your pronouns are. I'm assuming, and I do apologize for that. But I'm in Connecticut, where these types of laws don't exist, and our community, viral load, viral suppression is phenomenal, and new cases decrease every year.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have that data, Johnny. I don't know if you have any data or know anything about that, or could answer that.
No, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that question. I don't have. It's a good question, but I also think there's a lot of things that need to happen as we go into reforming these laws around the country. And I think these are the types of questions these are the types of studies that communities will need to do. So no, I don't have an answer to that as well. And I'm not aware of a study that references it, but I think it is something that communities definitely will want to probably take a look at as we kind of continue to move these processes forward.
Exactly. And then there's some other notes in the chat. In our state, in Pennsylvania, our provision laws are sentence enhancement laws, which are just as bad as having a statute law, especially for Black and brown people living with HIV in our state.
Can I jump in really quick, Malcolm, before we move past that? And I don't want to take up too much time because I know we're getting close. But one of the things I want to we talked about it in our presentation. I don't want to minimize the stigma conversation that comes along with all of this, right? So as we are moving forward to reform these laws around the country, we're also needing to educate folks about HIV at the same time, right? Because we're in the work so deeply, it's easy to take for granted that everybody knows what we know. And so our legislators, our elected officials, this is why elections matter. This is why asking questions to folks who are running for local elections where you are is important, because a lot of folks, there are people who don't know some of these things. And so to that point, I want to make sure that we also recognize that there is a lot of stigma that folks living with HIV experience, and a lot of that is conversations that we are also having in this conversation about reform of HIV criminal laws.
Right, and to piggyback off of that, Noah put in the chat box earlier, I feel that education is key, starting with the basics and leaving the complex issues for when a positive response is achieved through the basics of education. Exactly. Educating the people and educating your legislators about, what constitutes transmission of HIV, and reducing the stigma. Education is definitely needed. And I guess to close us out, I'll tell a story. Eric works with Georgia Equality, and every year Georgia Equality does an AIDS watch. And so we go to the Hill and we lobby for improving HIV laws, and we advocate for people living with HIV. And a couple of years ago, I said to my state senator at the time, I said, my name is Malcolm Reed and I am living with HIV. And he stepped back and he looked and he said, I said, I've been living with HIV for more than 20 years. And he stepped back and he said, well, you look good. And right there is the stigma point, right? Right there. Okay, Tammy has said we're scheduled for 90 minutes. I thought we were scheduled for an hour. So we've got time. Oh, great, good. Thank you, Tammy. So I said, I said, yeah, thank you very much. And I went on with my presentation. But the point is that he expected in his head that a person living with HIV for more than 20 years was going to be broke down, sick, half dead. I guess he expected me to wheel into the Capitol building on a gurney. But that just goes to show you that we do have work to do as far as education is concerned. What other questions can we answer for you? That was the last question in the chat. So that was answered,
And I'll just say this, Johnny, Johnny and Malcolm. The Center for HIV Law and Policy, if folks are really interested in learning more about U equals U and sort of the intersections of HIV criminalization, their consensus statement really does an excellent job of outlining that. And so before we hop off, I'll make sure that I drop the CHLP link for the consensus statement for folks who are just interested in reading more about sort of, those intersections.
And I guess, one thing that I'll add as well as we head to close is if there is a way to get involved where you are, if everything that you've heard, and I hope it does energize you to get involved where you are and where you live, please do find ways to engage in these efforts in your local community. And even for those places that do not have HIV-specific criminal laws on the books, as someone indicated, in the chat, there are other things, right? There are other types of penalties and sentence enhancements and all these other things that are things that also need to be tackled and handled in your local area. So I would say, please find a way to get involved because we do have to reform these laws to move us forward. We know what needs to happen. The criminal justice system isn't the way to deal with issues such as this. And this is not, there's no issue. There's nothing to deal with. So the criminal justice system isn't the place for this.
So Eric, I want to call out something else that I know that that you work on, and that is rather than dealing with the legislature head on, but that is to work with individual jurisdictions as far as the district attorneys are concerned and making sure that they don't file charges in these cases. Can you talk about that for a little while?
Absolutely. Prosecutors have a ton of discretion, prosecutorial discretion around the things that they're going to charge and the things that they're not going to charge. And, one strategy that we're working on here in Georgia, really is around engaging, prosecutors and having them not bring charges under the statute. And so, one of the things, in Fulton County, which is, the largest county in the state of Georgia, there was a DA's race. And one of the questions that, as a part of our advocacy that we posed during their campaign was, would they bring charges under the statute? And we were able to get both of the candidates at the time who were running to say that they would not bring charges under the statute. And so, we'll be holding them accountable. I do have a video of it. So, we'll be holding them accountable to, the promise they made to their constituents around not bringing charges under the statute. And I know, for a lot of folks who are involved in, abolitionist work, I know this may not be something that would resonate with everyone, but, it is another possible way for us to consider what our advocacy looks like. It also is a way that I think about how people living with HIV, build power to say, our vote counts and we're going to hold you accountable. And, if you're not doing work that's going to support our efforts, that you're not doing work that's going to reduce, barriers, then, we'll find someone else that we will elect. And so, it's also about, building that power. And so hopefully, we will target, other DAs. I have a list that I like to target, especially of the larger counties here in the state of Georgia. And it provides good incentive for legislators to then follow suit around changing the law here in the state. And so, it all builds, no part of the process is less important than the other. And so we need all the pieces working together for us to really get all the things that we're looking for.
Excellent, excellent. And Tammy, Marco, and a few other people have put some links into the chat box, so you guys can feel free to take a look at some of those resources. Teresa Sullivan mentions also educating judges on HIV transmission is important. Education, as we said, education is key, whether it be the judges, the DAs, everybody needs to understand HIV. And unfortunately, being in another pandemic, I sometimes get the feeling that HIV is moving toward the back of the line. But we have to keep it in the forefront. We have to make sure that people understand, well, we started this pandemic in the beginning of the year. We already have a vaccine. HIV is going to be 40 years old this year and next year, and we don't have a vaccine yet. So let's make sure that people still consider HIV and consider what they're doing when they criminalize people. Somebody mentioned earlier, I can't remember who it was, but mentioned earlier that the side effects of criminalization. If you have a felony on your record, you might not be able to get an apartment. You might not, there's so many things that you can't do. And so when you talk about the social determinants of health, now you're bleeding over there. So there are so many things that we have to fix in that regard.
Malcolm, I just want to add one more thing. Two things actually. One is just around. I think that COVID-19 and the criminalization and the surveillance that's happened as a part of the COVID epidemic has provided us a space to be able to talk about HIV criminalization in a way that I think people may be able to find it a bit more relatable now, as folks were being criminalized because of COVID-19. I think people can start to connect the dots between, why, carceral modes are not the best way to deal with public health issues. And so that's one. I do want us to also utilize this moment to say, hey, you see what's happening here is what's been happening with HIV over the past, 20 plus years that these laws have been on the books, 30 plus years. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing is, the current administration started a campaign to end HIV by 2030, the Ending the Epidemic Plan. As we bring in a new administration, I think this is also an opportunity for us to be in conversation about how we refine the ETE plan of ending the HIV epidemic by 2030 under new leadership, under a new administration, and then how do we again hold this administration accountable to making sure that the things are in place for us to end the epidemic by 2030 or by 2025. And so I think we're at a really important crossroads to be able to have some really powerful conversations to really elevate the voices of people who are living with HIV and really build power, real power to actualize change. And so those are the two things that I want to say. And, just again, thank, CIRO as a national partner, a partner in our work here in Georgia for really understanding what strong partnerships with state coalitions look like. And so just hats off to them and just, really much appreciation for the support and the work that CIRO does to advance all of these issues.
Amen to that. Amen to that. As a person who was new to this work several years ago, and I went to my first HIV is Not a Crime Academy, I was just blown away by not only the work that CIRO was doing, but also by the just the criminalization laws that were still on the books. I was a person living with HIV, and I never even thought about that. The education that I've received, just being at the academy and then following CIRO and working with Tammy and Kamaria and the whole group on other things has been phenomenal. And that's why I said we have to keep HIV in the forum. It has given us an opportunity. COVID has given us an opportunity to have that conversation and make it relatable. But there are still a lot of people that absolutely, and there's a dichotomy there, right? They believe that HIV is history, but yet, if you ask them, if you just ask them this question, if somebody has sex and does not disclose, should they go to jail? Their answer is yes. So it's like, okay, you think it's over, but you still want to criminalize. Think about that, and let's have a conversation about that. But the education about HIV is absolutely huge. Noah has what tools, if any, have been effective in getting ASOs on board?
So I think that this is another place where education is really important. I think ASOs a lot of times, because they're 501c3 status, don't understand what they can do by way of advocacy and lobbying. And so I think there are some opportunities around engaging ASOs around what that process looks like for them, and then how they're able to then engage folks who are coming there to utilize services, how they're able to then work with them on advocacy efforts and plugging them into some of this work. And so I think a lot of it is just really the engagement and making sure they have education around what they are able to do and what they're not able to do. Because I think a lot of the hesitation has been around, well, I'm a 501c3, I can't do X, Y, and Z.
And Eric, one thing that we talked about as an opportunity to move this work forward is also media training. So when we think about AIDS service organizations and other community-based organizations who are entrenched and ingrained into that local community, an opportunity exists to be able to train local media outlets, right, on proper ways to report about issues as it relates to health and in particular HIV, right? So there's a huge opportunity there from a media training perspective that helps to reduce stigma and also has an impact around HIV criminal law reform.
Exactly. I don't see any other questions or comments in the question and answer box or in the chat box. Tammy, is there anything else that you want us to discuss?
I don't think so, but I did want to thank Thrive SS and Malcolm for moderating and leading this third Road to HINAC4 webinar. And to Eric and Johnnie, thank you so much for this great presentation. I am going to be using some of your slides, crediting you, of course, because I believe in crediting people for their work. But thank you so much for this great presentation, and to Jose for doing translation and ensuring language justice. The next Road to HINAC webinar will be in February, led by the Positive Women's Network. So just keep your eye out for that information. Date hasn't been set yet, but after the first of the year, we will get that information out as soon as possible.
Fantastic. Well, with that, Johnnie, Eric, thank you so much. I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. And I'll see you out there in the fight. Everybody, if I don't see you before the holidays, have a very happy and safe holiday. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and stay away from the Proud Boys.
Bye, everybody.
Y'all take care. Thank you.